Hello, my name's Mick Child, Director of Forge Photography Limited, and today we're looking at ISO and how we use that with semi-manual mode AV. Welcome back. Hopefully you had a good Easter weekend, even though it was a little strange, perhaps being in lockdown. We certainly had a good weekend. I was out with both the stills camera taking macro photography, and I made a short meditation film, again using that macro probe that I showed you in one of the earlier episodes of the tutorial. So a quick recap on why we're doing these tutorials. Obviously a little bit out of my comfort zone, as you probably know. I like to be behind the camera, not in front of it. I run a photography club at both Rushmoor and St Andrew's schools in Bedford. We meet every Tuesday evening. Sometimes we go out, sometimes we do a little bit of theory. And over the course of the year, I like to take the students using bridge and DSLR cameras from a point where they know nothing about photography to a place where they can shoot in full manual mode, which is where we're hoping to get to with these tutorials. And before lockdown and before school finished for Easter, I did promise them that if lockdown did occur, and obviously it has done, that I'd run these tutorials to help them keep their skills up and actually learn some new skills and maybe get to a point where they are shooting in full manual when we go back to school. And then we can go out in the field, hopefully, once the rules have all been relaxed, and we can start to take some photographs out in the field using full manual mode. Today we're going to look at the ISO, or ISO as we more commonly refer to it, setting on your camera. And to get you started with ISO and understanding it a little better, we're going to use AV mode. Remember semi-manual mode that we went through with you on a couple of the earlier tutorials, which obviously you can recap on. So when we did the AV settings, we used ISO in the automatic setting, so the camera was setting the ISO that it thought you needed, but that's fairly limiting, and I'm going to show you why we want to be able to control ISO ourselves. And it's quite simple really once you get used to doing it. And a semi-manual mode is a good place to start teaching you. So if I show you why we want to adjust ISO for AV, so in other words for aperture priority, and if I show you why we want to set it for TV for shutter priority, then I think you'll have a better idea when we move to manual of how to make all these settings work together. But before we do that, I normally show you some of the kit that I have. I'm going to show you some kit that I don't really use very much anymore, and that's a Speedlite or a flash or a strobe that I use on top of my camera. Now, you might look at my camera and think, he hasn't got a flash on here, and I don't. There is no flash on here. When you buy a professional camera, you won't buy a camera that has a flash that pops up on it. And there's a big reason for that. And the main reason is that we want to actually choose the kind of flash units that we use. 90% of my work, in fact probably 95% of my work where I do use a flash, I'm actually using a flash on stands. So I position my light around my model or around the subject that I'm photographing, and I control that with a trigger on what we call our hot shoe. Now there is a difference between a hot shoe and a cold shoe. You've probably heard the terms before, maybe not, I don't know, but a hot shoe is a shoe that the camera will trigger, okay? A cold shoe is not controllable by the camera. So sometimes I'll have an attachment that will go onto my camera, like a monitor, and that's a cold shoe connector because there's no connection between the monitor, if you like, and the camera, other than I use a lead into the camera. So it would be a cold shoe fitting in that application. But when I use a flash unit, either directly on the hot shoe or with a trigger, then it's a hot shoe because when I push the shutter on the camera, then it fires a signal to my flashlight, which then takes a shot. Okay, so let's have a look at the flash, the strobe, or as Canon call this, the Speedlite. Now there are many different types of flashes that you can buy, and there are different ways of using them. And a bit like the lenses that I showed you, using a flash really warrants its own tutorials. You know, I could probably do 3 or 4 tutorials about how to use a flash, particularly a Speedlite. They have a number of settings on Speedlites, and there is an automatic setting that will link to your camera called ETTL, where the camera and the Speedlite do calculations and then take the shots. you can make minor adjustments, a bit like the semi-manual modes that you can on your camera to get the perfect shot. But mainly I shoot in manual mode, as I do with my camera on the flashlight. So I'm going to have to go back, if we do look at this in more detail, and I'm going to have to work out how to use it in the semi-manual modes or the automatic modes between the camera and the flashlight, because I haven't used it like that in a long time. Also, this is this is a 580 EX2 Speedlite. Okay, this is an infrared triggered Speedlite, so you can have a trigger that fires an infrared signal and then makes it shoot. If you were to buy the new version of this, it would be a radio signal, for instance, that works. So in bright sunlight or those sort of conditions, or in a condition where you're not directly looking, or the trigger isn't directly looking at the speed light and the infrared sensor, a radio signal makes things much more flexible for you, and it guarantees a shot, whereas this infrared can be a bit hit and miss. Although, to be fair, most applications that I ever used it in were absolutely perfect. But before we look at the trigger, and I do have a trigger in this little pouch here, let's look at how this fits onto the camera. So basically, we have a hot shoe connection. We make sure that everything is powered down when we put it on, and then this literally fits onto the hot shoe, and then there's a lock here. We click it in and click it home. And now we have the flash on the unit. So let's take the flash off. Quite a simple process. We push a little button in there on this one and undo it, put it down. Let's have a look at this transmitter that I use. Again, this is infrared. So you'll see, if we have a look there, there's the infrared sensor, and on the front of this is an infrared sensor there. Now, I've not used this in absolutely ages, probably doesn't even have a battery in it, to be quite honest with you, didn't check that. Pushes onto the hot shoe, there's a locking mechanism there. It's now locked on, can't fall off because we don't want it falling off. And what this transmitter does, it allows me to move my flash now off the camera and move it around, and we can get much more artistic with the flash and where we position it, and also control up to 2 flashlights with this particular controller, which is really useful as well. And as you can see on the back there, I have lots and lots of settings that I can do to adjust how much light I'm sending or using on each flashlight as I shoot. Okay, we'll take that off now, and we'll talk a little bit about ISO. And as if by magic, everything's away. So let's put the, I'm not going to take any photos, but let's put the lens hood on anyway, because we like to have the lens hood on, as we say. When we go out next time, we're going to be shooting in AV mode, so set your dial to AV. If the aperture is small, okay, in other words, it's a large number, then we're letting less light into the sensor on the camera. But what we're actually doing is we're increasing our depth of field. So let's have a think of about that for a moment. If I'm increasing my depth of field and I'm letting less light in, it means I've got to make an adjustment. Now, if I'm on AV, the camera is automatically going to adjust the shutter speed for me. But remember, let's think if I'm shooting a landscape where I want lots of detail in focus. I might be shooting f11 up to f16, which is the sweet spot on this particular lens. If I'm shooting f16, there isn't much light coming in, so it's going to have to slow down the shutter speed in order to let enough light in to properly expose the image. Now, we did set a rule, didn't we, that we broke last time, that we said the shutter speed shouldn't be less than 1/100th of a second, but we learned that we can actually shoot quite adequately, if we're careful, at 1/150th of a second. But let's stick back to our original rule and let's shoot at 1/100th of a second again. So if we've got our AV set and we're looking through our viewfinder, our camera will be telling us what shutter speed we're getting for the aperture that we've set. And if you see your shutter speed reducing below 1/100th of a second, you've got a problem. And the problem is that we might get a blurry image. So what we can do is we can set the ISO setting. ISO is given a range of numbers. Normally it will start at around about 100, which is the base value for your camera, and it will go up to something typically like 1600 or ISO 3200. Then as you get into the more professional cameras, it will go higher and higher and higher. And what ISO does, it actually sets the brightness of your picture. So if you have ISO 100 and then you set ISO 200, basically what you've done is you've doubled the brightness of your image. If you go from 200 to 400, again, you've doubled the brightness. And you keep doubling every time you go up. So 400 to 800, you double the brightness again. So what you can do in certain situations, like I suggested there for your landscape photography, where you're letting less light in, you can increase the ISO to increase the brightness of the picture and expose it properly. Also, if it's getting dark in the evening or it's dark in the morning, you can adjust your ISO setting up so that you get more brightness, more light onto the sensor. So the thing with ISO is that the higher the value, the more power that your camera is putting down onto the sensor to increase that brightness for you. As it does that, it introduces something called grain or noise, which you might not want to see in your picture. What I would say to you is, you're better to have noise and have a really nicely focused image than you are to have no noise and have a blurry image because your shutter speed was too slow. If we think again about the aperture then, and I suggested that we might have a small aperture, say f16, for a landscape photo where we're letting less light in, so we increase our ISO. If in fact we wanted to have a shallow depth of field, then what we would have to do is actually reduce the level of our ISO, which is good for us really, because then we're going to get a less grainy picture. What I want you to do now is I want you to make sure that your dial is set to AV, Aperture Priority, and I want you to switch your camera on and take the lens cap off. First thing I want you to do is I want you to set the aperture nice and wide, so set it to a low f-stop value, for instance 5.6, so let's set our aperture to 5.6. And then what I want you to do is I want you to take it off auto ISO because your setting is currently at auto ISO. So I push the ISO button here and I turn the dial here and I'm at 100. 100 is the base value, remember, of the ISO setting. So it's a very low setting. It's not putting much power at all onto the sensor at the moment, okay. If you half depress the shutter now, it's going to give you a value. Now, you might read the value of shutter speed on the top, as I do with the Canon, or you might read it on the back. I can read it in both places. So I've got a shutter speed of 1/6 of a second there, and the same it's reading out on the back for me, 1/6 of a second, okay? What I want you to do is double the brightness now. Remember, if we go from 100 ISO to 200 ISO, we've doubled the brightness. So let's double the brightness. ISO 200, that's set now. Now half depress your shutter again, and you'll see that I'm getting 1/13 of a second. I'm not sure what you're getting there. So my shutter speed is speeding up, but it's still not at the threshold of 1/100th of a second. So we'll double it again from 200 to 400. So push the ISO button, set your ISO to 400, and then half depress your shutter again and see what you're getting. Now I'm getting 1/25th of a second now. So let's double that ISO again. So from 400 to 800, we'll again double the amount of brightness. There's 800 ISO. Now I'm getting 1/50th of a second. Remember, we're at aperture f5.6. Now I could take a shot with that quite happily, and if I brace myself properly, take a shot, I'm going to get a nice shot in focus, okay? Right, but that's still not at the level that we wanted. So if we've got 800, what's 2 times 800? 1600. So let's double our ISO again. Let's double our brightness again by taking our ISO to 1600. So take it to 1600. Now I'm getting, when I half depress my shutter, I'm getting 1/125th of a second. Remember, we said 1/100th was going to be our minimum. So now we can comfortably at 1125 take a picture. Okay, here we go. I'll take a picture of you looking at me. There we go. Wonderful. Okay, so that's ISO. Really what we need to do is we need to get out there in the daylight. We need to try some different shots in different lights, in different scenarios where we've got shadows. I hope that's been of some interest to you. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Press the bell, send me a message so that we can try and talk about the answers in one of our future tutorials. Maybe we'll talk a bit more about Flash in the future. I hope that kind of gave you a very short insight into it, but of course, you know, we want to talk about Flash in more detail maybe at some point. I've also been asked by Zach whether or not I could talk about different lenses and how I use different lenses out in the field. And yes, of course, Zach will probably look to do that in the future as well if we're still in lockdown. Otherwise, when we get back to school, we'll bring some lenses in and we'll have a play at school. Okay, we'll see you again, same time. Should be next Tuesday. Look forward to seeing you. Have a great weekend.